F.M Alexander was an Australian actor who developed the educational process that is today called the Alexander Technique, a form of education that is applied to recognize and overcome reactive habitual limitations in movement and thinking. Alexander was born on a large isolated farm in Wynyard, Tasmania, the oldest of 8 children. He was a precocious child and, suffering from respiratory problems, was taken out of school to be educated privately. As his health began to improve at around age 9, he developed an affinity to horses, eventually becoming adept at training and managing them. He also developed a love for theater, particularly Shakespeare, which would lay the foundations for his future career. At age 16, financial pressures forced Alexander to forsake his rural life, moving him to the mining town of Mount Bishop. He worked at a variety of jobs in the daytime and in the evenings entertained himself studying drama and teaching himself the violin. After 3 years, he moved to Melbourne, continuing his dramatic and musical training under the city's best teachers. During this period, he spent his time visiting theaters, concerts, and art galleries, in addition to organizing his own amateur dramatic company in his spare time. After his money ran out, he worked odd jobs to support himself. However, a combination of recurrent illness, distaste for commercial life, and what was then a violent temper ensured that he never held any job for very long. In his early 20s, he decided to devote himself to a career as an actor and reciter. He soon established an excellent reputation giving recitals and producing plays. His specialty at the time was a one-man show of dramatic and humorous pieces heavily laced with Shakespeare. In the late 1890s, Alexander began to progressively lose his voice during his performances as a Shakespearean orator. Over time, it would become increasingly hoarse. As his career depended on his ability to project his voice, he faced the possibility of having to retire. He sought advice from voice coaches, doctors, and specialists without results, and finally attempted to resolve the problems himself. Alexander felt that his physical actions were to blame for the problem, so he arranged mirrors so that he could observe his actions in detail as he performed. As he did this, he discovered his physical use of his body was not as he perceived it, and the resolutions to his tensions and misuses were not what he expected. The detail of his discoveries are documented in his third and most popular publication, The Use of the Self, published in 1932. After discovering this, Alexander found that his asthma symptoms were greatly reduced to the extent that it was no longer a concern. He originally developed the Alexander Technique as a method of vocal training for singers and actors in the 1890s. While Alexander was developing his method of voice training, he realized that the basis for all successful voice education was an efficiently and naturally functioning respiratory mechanism. So, in teaching voice, Alexander focused primarily on helping the breathing mechanism to function more effectively. Because of his focus on re-educating the breathing mechanism, some of Alexander's students who had come to him for vocal training found that their respiratory difficulties also improved. These improvements were recognized by medical doctors who began referring their patients with respiratory ailments to Alexander for help. In this way, F.M. Alexander's technique of vocal training developed into a technique he termed respiratory re-education. Alexander had also made the discovery that breathing and vocalization are part and parcel of how the body functions as a whole. Habitual breathing and vocal patterns are parts of habitual patterns of general coordination. In fact, many problems we see as involving just one particular part of the body, example lower back pain and RSI, are often symptoms of larger habitual patterns of malcoordination. Just as people had found Alexander's vocal technique helped them with their breathing problems, so a number of his students found his method of respiratory re-education helped them with other physical difficulties. Basically, Alexander had evolved a method for learning how to consciously change maladaptive habits of coordination. Coordination includes movement, posture, breathing, and tension patterns. He had come to the understanding that the mind and body function as an integrated entity, a rather unusual realization for the time. Alexander found that habits, whether physical habits or mental habits, are all psychophysical in nature. He observed that how we think about our activities determines how we coordinate ourselves to do those activities, and, equally, how long-held habits of excessive tension and inefficient coordination affect how we think and feel. In a relatively short period of time, Alexander evolved his technique from a method of vocal training into a method of breathing re-education, and then into a comprehensive technique of psychophysical re-education. His technique deals with the psychophysical coordination of the whole person, or what he termed more concisely as the use of the self. Here is a video of F.M. Alexander with narration explaining some of the basics of his technique.
He had discovered the necessity of poise, of using the full height and lengthening in stature as a basis for all activity. Breathing, circulation and digestion, all the functioning of the body is dependent on poise, and poise is dependent on how you use yourself. His technique is about the attainment of poise, how you use yourself in all the activities of life. Now, Margaret Goldie has just come in, and he starts to work on her. With one hand on the top of her head and the other on her back, he encourages her to lengthen by freeing the neck and directing the head forward and up. She keeps her length as he sits her in the chair. He slowly leans her backwards, still maintaining lengthening and freedom. His hands promote the antagonistic action of the direction between the head and the body, so that lengthening and widening, expansion of the rib cage, and breathing takes place.
Make sure there's enough room around your chair and around others to be able to perform the following. Try to breathe from high up in your chest or from low down in your abdomen. Now, try walking or moving your arms while you breathe in one of these ways. Do you walk or move your arms differently when you change your breathing? Do you make a conscious effort to change the way you walk or the way you hold your neck, or try clenching your arms? Do these efforts affect your breathing or your voice? What if these were habitual efforts, efforts which you made all the time but you were unaware that you were making them? We do make habitual excessive efforts most of the time, but we are generally unaware of making them. Excessive stress in one part of the body is usually part of a larger pattern of habitual malcoordination. Now let's take our seats again and hear an introduction to the Alexander technique with Marjorie Barstow.
One summer, I went to New York with my dancing teacher, Charlotte Whedon. Charlotte came into the apartment one day and said, she'd picked up an Atlantic Monthly, and she said, I have an interesting article here about a man. Would you like to read it? I said, well, certainly I would. It was called The Philosopher's Stone, and it was about a man by the name F.M Alexander. I read 2 books he had written, and I got so fascinated with them that I just knew I wanted to study with him. So I closed my dancing studio and went to England. My sister went with me. My mother didn't think it was very wise for a little green country girl like me to go off to the big city of London all alone. So we went off. And of course there weren't planes flying in those days. You went by ship. And we landed in England in a pea soup fog, which neither of us had ever heard of or seen. But we finally found the train and made our way to London. And then we found a place to live with an English couple who had 2 small children. It was real exciting. And then I met Mr. Alexander. I found him to be a charming English gentleman. He was a great Shakespearean reciter and actor. And there was a time when he practically lost his voice. he studied himself for clues to find out what was wrong. Finally, one time he discovered that just before he started to perform, he threw his head back and down. He got a very heavy pressure in the back of his neck. He found out that he could release that downward pressure by simply moving his head slightly away from his body. And he noticed as his head moved very slightly away from his body that there was a tendency for his body to move along with it. Then he began to see how often we just push ourselves up and stick our chests out and pull our shoulders back. That's a fixture. Now, you don't hold that very long, because if you're going into activity, you really want flexibility. And if I do a little thing like this, and I move around, then I've lost that downward pull, and I'm allowing my respiratory mechanism to have a chance to function. And gradually, as he could continue with that, his hoarseness disappeared and he had no more trouble with his voice. He began to tell his friends about what he was doing. And his friends began to say, well, why don't you help us if this is so good for you? They were having some of the same problems. So he started helping them. Word spread, and soon people were coming from all over the world to study with him. He worked with John Dewey, George Bernard Shaw. Aldous Huxley even made Alexander into a character in one of his novels. I was the first person to finish Alexander's first teacher's training course. When I left England, I knew I had learned a great deal about his discovery. Children move lightly and easily. If you learn to watch, you will notice that their little heads always start any movement they make. And you see, we have interfered with that. Alexander's discovery gives us back our natural, much more of our natural ease and flexibility of movement. So you see, it's a form of movement.
Could you show us what you mean by that? It's a form of movement? Could you demonstrate it for us?
Oh.
You don't try to find
Yes.
a book and describe what you
Most people, in picking up a book, if you'd watch them, they'd come down this way to pick up the book. Now, look what they've done. See how they pulled their body down? And see the pressure I have here? Now, they don't feel that because they've grown up doing that for a long time. Now, there's no reason why, if I want to pick that up, I just don't leave my body alone. Where do I move from in both instances? My hip joint is where I really move from. Now, if I move from my hip joint, all I have to do is move my arm to pick up the book. There's no reason why I have to add this to the fact that I want to put the book down or pick it up. That's a very, very simple way to demonstrate it, but that's the thing we do. And Alexander's work is very simple, and as you say, it's extremely elusive, but it's the ease in which you redirect that energy so that the downward pressures just can't exist. He gently put his hands, one hand very delicately here, and another hand very delicately back here. And he would ask us to think of noticing what his hands were doing and allowing our heads to move just a tiny bit in the direction he was suggesting. And that's the same thing here. I'm helping you with this little bit of ease to understand it, both from a thinking point of view and the ease with which you can move. Now, as I help you here and link your body up with that, now you're the one who has to remember to carry those two things on while you play. I can't do that for you. That's where your responsibility comes in. See? So you can trust your own reasoning and go ahead and just make up your mind, this is the thing you're going to do, and your arms fit into it.
Oh, that's very different.
No, it's different, but it's fun. It's quite fascinating. It's when you have that experience that you really begin to understand what Alexander's discovered.
Alexander continued to develop his theories throughout his life, developing such concepts as primary control, verbal visualization, avoiding reaction during speaking, and using modeling in teaching. He wrote several other books and instructed many students until his sudden death in 1955. There are many books written about and expanding on the Alexander technique. Visit your local library or check online to find more information about F.M. Alexander and the Alexander technique.